Rowan Cross had been staring at the same wall panel for 45 minutes, which meant either his tactical awareness had deteriorated significantly, or the Carthian ambassador was even more boring than the security briefing suggested. The wall panel won. At least it had interesting geometric patterns that formed different shapes depending on how long you looked at them, which was more than could be said for Ambassador Threck's speech about trade route optimization through the Helix sector. The diplomatic wing of Nexus Prime smelled like filtered air and expensive anxiety. 17 worlds had sent representatives to this Accord renewal ceremony, which happened once every solar cycle, and apparently required everyone to dress uncomfortably and pretend they enjoyed standing for hours while people discussed things that could have been handled through subspace communications. Rowan adjusted his formal uniform collar, felt the tactical earpiece dig slightly into his ear canal, and wondered if the Veltheran delegation had brought their own caterers, because the shrimp at the last reception had given him food poisoning that made him question humanity's decision to explore space in the first place. 6 years on Nexus Prime. 6 years of protecting diplomats who mostly needed protection from their own terrible decisions, like the Terran Coalition representative, who kept trying to bring unauthorized recording devices into secure areas, or the Zenthari trade minister who had somehow gotten drunk on oxygen-rich air and started singing what the translation matrix rendered as either love ballads or threats of bodily harm, depending on tonal inflection. This posting had seemed like exactly what Rowan needed after the colony skirmish that killed his entire squad and left him with the kind of survivor's guilt that made sleep optional and memories unavoidable. Predictable security work. Methodical threat assessment. Nobody dying on his watch because nobody was supposed to die at diplomatic functions unless the food was really that bad. Princess Listen of Velthar moved through the reception crowd like water finding paths around stones, her white skin luminous under the ambient lighting that Nexus Prime engineering had calibrated to accommodate species with varying visual spectrums. Blonde hair fell past her shoulders in a style that seemed effortless but probably required significant maintenance, and her ears rose to elegant points that marked her as definitively not human despite how easily she might pass for one at a distance. Rowan had been assigned to her personal protection detail 3 days ago, which mostly meant standing at appropriate distances while she made diplomatic conversation and occasionally laughed at jokes that the translation matrix rendered incomprehensible. She was good at this, he'd noticed. The formal posture when speaking with the Terran Coalition representative shifted to something warmer with the Carthian ambassador, became almost playful with the Zenthari delegation. She remembered names. She thanked the servers individually and had apparently memorized which dietary restrictions applied to which species, because she'd steered Ambassador Threck away from the buffet table containing foods that would have triggered his biological incompatibility with capsaicin. Rowan found himself cataloging details he shouldn't need for security purposes. The way she touched her left ear when nervous, how her violet eyes scanned room exits before settling into conversations, the fact that she'd worn the same formal dress to 2 consecutive events which suggested either a fashion statement or a practical approach to diplomatic functions that he appreciated. The reception dragged toward its inevitable conclusion, where everyone would exchange pleasantries that meant nothing and schedule follow-up meetings that would accomplish nothing. Rowan was mentally composing his end-of-shift report when Princess Listen did something unexpected. She slipped away from a conversation with 3 delegates who were arguing about antimatter containment protocols, moved toward a side corridor with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going, and headed for the observation deck in Section 7. Protocol said Rowan should maintain visual contact. Common sense said she was just taking a break from people who talked about antimatter containment like it was interesting. He followed at a discreet distance, which on Nexus Prime meant approximately 30 feet, because the corridors were designed by engineers who understood that space stations worked better when people weren't constantly bumping into each other. The observation deck was empty except for the view. Stars scattered across darkness in patterns that made Rowan's earthborn brain struggle with scale and distance, nebulae glowing in colors that had names he'd never learned. And somewhere in that impossible vastness was the planet where he'd been born and the colony where his squad had died, and all the space in between that he'd crossed trying to find something that looked like purpose. Princess Listen stood at the transparent aluminum viewport, her reflection ghostly against the starfield. She didn't turn when Rowan entered, but her voice carried clearly in the observation deck's acoustics. "Do you ever get tired of watching people pretend to like each other?" Rowan stopped. Security protocol didn't cover what to do when your assignment asked philosophical questions. "It's mostly what diplomatic functions are for, Your Highness." "Listen." She turned, and her smile was genuine in a way her diplomatic expressions hadn't been. "If we're going to have honest conversations about existential tedium, you should probably use my name." That would violate approximately 7 different protocols. "I won't tell if you don't." She leaned against the viewport, her posture relaxed in a way that made Rowan's threat assessment instincts recalibrate. "I've been watching you watch everyone else. Do you find us all ridiculous or just diplomatically challenged?" Rowan considered his response carefully. "I find that most security assignments are successful specifically because nothing interesting happens." Listen laughed, and it sounded nothing like her diplomatic laugh. "I'll try to be more boring then, though I should warn you that my idea of exciting is arguing about xenolinguistic syntax structures, so you're probably safe." "Appreciated." They stood in comfortable silence for maybe 30 seconds, which was exactly when Rowan's tactical earpiece crackled with cross-chatter about unauthorized access signatures in the lower decks. He was reaching for his communicator when the signal died, replaced by the distinctive white noise of electronic interference that security drills had taught him to recognize immediately. The lights flickered. Once. Twice. Gravity fluctuated for 3 stomach-dropping seconds that made Rowan's inner ear scream confusion. Then the distant sound of decompression alarms started bleeding through the station's infrastructure, and every instinct Rowan had developed through 6 years of station duty and 12 years of military service before that started screaming in unison. His hand was on Princess Listen's elbow before conscious thought caught up. Safe room, 3 corridors, move. She didn't argue, didn't ask questions, just moved with him as the first explosion bloomed somewhere in the diplomatic wing like a terrible flower made of fire and decompression. Rowan's tactical overlay activated automatically, displaying station schematics and threat assessments that updated too slowly because whatever was happening fast. More explosions, screaming, the peculiar sound of hull plating failing structural integrity tests. They covered 2 corridors in 40 seconds. Princess Listen kept pace without complaint, her formal dress entirely impractical for running, but she managed anyway. And Rowan was recalculating routes based on explosion patterns when he saw it. 50 feet ahead, a compact device magnetically attached to the bulkhead, its display counting down from 7 seconds, positioned exactly where they'd be in 3 running steps. 7 seconds. 6. 5. Rowan's body knew what to do before his mind finished calculating impossibilities. Cannot reach it. Cannot disarm it. Cannot do anything except one thing. He wrapped both arms around Princess Listen, pivoted his entire body between her and the device, and felt the world become fire and force, and a sound that erased every other sound. Pressure that collapsed ribs and ruptured organs and sent them both tumbling through smoke and chaos, his body breaking against bulkheads while hers remained cradled against his chest. The pain was absolute, then distant, then irrelevant. Rowan's fading consciousness registered 3 things with perfect clarity. Princess Listen was moving beneath him, so she was alive. His blood was very red against her white skin, and Queen Vayandra's face appeared above him like a stern angel with pointed ears before everything became absolutely nothing at all. Sound returned first, which seemed unfair because Rowan would have preferred vision or at least the ability to move his fingers. The sound was a high-pitched whine that gradually separated into distinct components. Medical equipment humming with the particular frequency that suggested advanced technology, voices speaking in musical Veltharan that his brain couldn't process, and somewhere distant the low thrum of starship engines that felt different from station machinery. His body existed as a catalog of sensations that the part of his brain still functioning properly identified as pain being aggressively managed by pharmaceutical intervention. Opening his eyes required more effort than it should have. The ceiling was carved stone, which made absolutely no sense because space stations and starships used metal and composite materials, not decorative architecture that belonged in palaces. Rowan blinked several times, convinced his vision was malfunctioning, but the carved stone remained stubbornly architectural. "You're awake." The voice came from his left, speaking Terran Standard with the slight melodic accent that marked native Veltharan speakers. "You've been unconscious for 6 days. We're in the Royal Medical Facility aboard my mother's flagship. You saved my life." Rowan turned his head with the kind of slowness that suggested his neck had forgotten how joints worked. Princess Listen sat in a chair beside his bed, her blonde hair unbound and falling past her shoulders, violet eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, still wearing clothes that carried dark stains his dazed mind eventually recognized as his blood. She looked terrible, which seemed like an inappropriate observation about royalty but happened to be accurate. He tried to speak. His throat produced a sound like malfunctioning machinery. Listen reached for a cup with a straw, held it while Rowan drank water that tasted like the best thing he'd ever consumed in his entire life. "Don't try to talk yet. The doctor said your throat was damaged from intubation, also from screaming during the initial medical procedures, but they were less specific about that part." Rowan drank more water, felt his brain slowly reassemble itself into something resembling functionality. How bad? The explosion. Listen set the cup down with careful precision. 17 people died, including 2 ambassadors. Security stopped the attackers, but not before they caused massive station damage. Nexus Prime is operational, but barely. The Accord renewal ceremony has been postponed indefinitely, which I suspect the terrorists would consider a victory if most of them weren't dead. How bad was I? Listen's expression did something complicated. Collapsed lung, ruptured spleen, fractured ribs in 7 places, internal bleeding that required 3 separate surgical interventions, second-degree burns across your back. The doctors grew you a new spleen using accelerated cellular regeneration, reinflated your lung with synthetic membranes, and basically reconstructed your torso from the inside out. She paused. "You should have died. Multiple doctors have told me you should have died. One of them seemed personally offended that you didn't." Rowan processed this information with the part of his brain that wasn't currently focused on the fact that breathing hurt despite the obvious pain medication. "You're not injured. Not even a scratch." Listen looked down at her hands, "because you turned yourself into a human shield, which was very heroic and very stupid, and I've been sitting here for 6 days trying to figure out how to thank someone for almost dying so you wouldn't." "It's the job. The job is protection, not suicide." Rowan attempted a shrug, discovered his shoulders had strong opinions about movement. Seemed like the best option at the time. There were other options: running faster, changing direction, letting me take partial blast impact instead of absorbing all of it yourself. Listen's voice carried an edge that surprised him. "You made a choice. Don't diminish it by calling it just the job." They sat in silence for a moment. Rowan studied the carved stone ceiling and tried to inventory which parts of his body hurt most, which was difficult because the answer appeared to be all of them simultaneously. Your mother has an interesting taste in starship architecture. The flagship is 400 years old and considered a historical artifact. My mother refuses to modernize it because tradition matters more than crew comfort or practical engineering. Listen smiled slightly. You'll hate it. The corridors are designed for aesthetic contemplation rather than efficient movement, and half the doorways are too short for average human height. Looking forward to it. Liar. The days that followed developed a rhythm. Listen visited every morning, initially making formal inquiries about his condition and expressing gratitude in carefully diplomatic language that sounded like she'd rehearsed it. Rowan responded with equally formal acceptance until the third day when he told her that if she thanked him one more time, he'd request transfer to a station where the diplomatic assignments were less polite. She'd laughed, actually laughed, and after that the visits became something closer to actual conversation. She brought books from the ship's library, human classics she'd read and wanted to discuss, which led to arguments about whether Hemingway was profound or just depressed. Rowan argued for depressed. Listen insisted profundity and depression weren't mutually exclusive and cited specific passages from The Old Man and the Sea that she'd apparently memorized. They debated whether pre-spaceflight science fiction counted as actual science fiction or just fantasy with technical terminology, disagreed about the ending of Foundation, and discovered shared appreciation for authors who understood that space travel was mostly boring, interrupted by moments of absolute terror. You studied literature. Rowan asked during one of these discussions, propped up in bed with synthetic membranes doing whatever synthetic membranes did to lungs. Xenolinguistics, actually, but literature is part of language study. You can't understand how species communicate without understanding what they choose to communicate about. Listen was sitting cross-legged in her chair, which seemed undignified for royalty, but she didn't appear to care. I speak 7 languages fluently, can get by in 4 more, and still find human idioms completely baffling. What does it mean to pull someone's leg, and why is it considered friendly? No idea. English is confusing, and I grew up speaking it. Comforting. What Rowan didn't mention during these conversations was how much he looked forward to them. How the sound of Listen's footsteps in the corridor made his heart rate increase in ways the medical monitors probably noticed. How her laugh seemed to make the pain medication work better. 6 days unconscious, another 12 days conscious, and somewhere in that time the princess he'd been assigned to protect had become the person whose visits marked the difference between tolerating recovery and actually enduring it. But more significant than Listen's visits were her mother's. Queen Vaendra came daily, always unannounced, sometimes sitting in silence for entire visits while Rowan pretended to sleep, because having royalty watch you breathe was deeply uncomfortable. Other times she asked questions about his military service, his family, his plans for the future. Rowan answered honestly because lying to Queen seemed inadvisable, and also because the pain medication made filtering responses more difficult than usual. Your parents, Queen Vaendra asked during one visit, dead, transport accident 8 years ago. Siblings? None. Romantic attachments? No. Future plans beyond security work? Rowan had considered this question extensively during his recovery, mostly during the hours between midnight and dawn when pain made sleep impossible. I hadn't thought that far ahead, Your Majesty. Queen Vaendra's expression during these visits bothered him. Initially gratitude, which made sense. Then assessment, which he understood. Finally something calculating that made his tactical instincts activate despite being confined to a medical bed. She watched him the way people watched complex problems they were solving, and Rowan couldn't determine what problem he represented. After 6 weeks, the doctors cleared him for normal activities with extensive caveats about avoiding explosions, high-impact exercise, and heavy lifting. Rowan celebrated by walking to the ship's observation deck without stopping to rest, which the doctors would probably disapprove of, but felt like victory anyway. He was standing there watching stars he couldn't name when two royal guards appeared with formal expressions and body language that suggested this wasn't a social visit. "Queen Vaendra requests your presence in the throne room at the 9th hour," the taller guard said in Terran Standard that suggested recent language training. "Formal attire will be provided. Attendance is not optional." The guards left. Rowan stared at the stars and felt the uncomfortable certainty that his life was about to become significantly more complicated. Princess Listen appeared an hour later, her face troubled in ways that made Rowan's carefully recovered ribs ache with renewed anxiety. "My mother has been secretive and strange, which isn't unusual, but this level of secrecy is concerning. Whatever is happening tomorrow, I want you to know I argued against formal ceremonies. You've done enough. You deserve to return to normal life." "What ceremony?" "I don't know." Listen met his eyes. "That's what worries me." The formal uniform someone left in Rowan's quarters fit perfectly, which suggested either excellent guessing or concerning surveillance of his measurements. He'd been on royal flagships for 2 months and still couldn't determine which walls had monitoring systems and which were just decorative stone that happened to look ominous. The uniform was Terran diplomatic style, with Veltheran embellishments he didn't recognize, which probably meant something significant to people who understood ceremonial clothing symbolism. His ribs ached despite medical clearance. The synthetic membranes in his lung occasionally produced sensations that felt like breathing through expensive machinery, which technically he was. Rowan checked his appearance in the mirror, decided he looked approximately presentable, and wondered if showing up to royal audiences while still recovering from explosive decompression was some kind of etiquette violation he should have researched. The throne room was designed by someone who understood that architecture could be weaponized. The ceiling rose maybe 40 feet, carved with patterns that drew the eye upward and made individuals feel appropriately insignificant. The carpet stretched from the entrance to the dais like an accusation of distance, deep blue material that probably cost more than Rowan's annual salary, and felt wrong to walk on with boots designed for station corridors. Nobles lined both sides in formal arrangement, their expressions ranging from curious to disapproving, and Rowan realized with sinking certainty that he was the entertainment. Queen Vaendra sat in state on a throne that managed to look ancient and functional simultaneously, her posture absolutely rigid in ways that suggested either incredible back strength or really good corset engineering. Princess Listen stood to her right, wearing formal robes that were probably traditional and definitely expensive, her face carefully neutral in a way that made Rowan's threat assessment instincts start screaming warnings. He walked the carpet. It took approximately forever. Some nobles whispered behind hands or whatever appendages their species used for discreet communication. Others stared openly. One Carthian delegate appeared to be taking notes, which seemed excessive for what Rowan had assumed would be a brief commendation ceremony before he could return to medical leave, and the blessed normalcy of having no one pay attention to him. Rowan stopped at the appropriate distance from the dais, which he estimated based on where the carpet had a subtle pattern change that probably indicated formal positioning. He executed what he hoped was an acceptable bow for someone who'd never actually practiced bowing to alien royalty. Queen Vaendra spoke. The ship's translation system rendered her musical Veltheran into Terran, standard with the flat precision of algorithmic linguistics. "Rowan Cross, you threw yourself between death and my daughter. You took wounds meant for her body into your own. You would have died so she could live." "Yes, Your Majesty." Rowan kept his voice steady despite growing certainty that this was not going to be a simple medal ceremony. In Veltheran tradition, one who takes a death blow for royal blood has earned that royal's hand in marriage. Queen Vaendra's expression remained absolutely neutral. "You have proven yourself through sacrifice. Therefore I decree that Princess Listen will be yours." The throne room erupted in murmured shock that sounded like expensive fabric rustling at high volume. Rowan's brain performed several complete reboots trying to process words that existed in correct grammatical order, but failed to make any kind of sense when assembled together. He looked at Princess Listen, who appeared equally stunned, her violet eyes wide with something between disbelief and panic, her mouth opening slightly as if to protest before closing again. "Your Majesty." Rowan found his voice somewhere beneath the mounting horror of social catastrophe. "I was doing my duty as her security officer. I didn't expect. I don't. This is." Queen Vaendra raised one hand with the kind of gesture that demanded immediate silence and probably worked on small children and subordinate nobles. Veltheran law is absolute in this matter. To refuse such sacrifice with medals or monetary reward would dishonor both the sacrifice and the one protected. My daughter owes you a life debt that can only be satisfied through binding your lives together. I will not allow her to live in perpetual debt to anyone. Mother, Princess Listen's voice carried clearly despite obvious efforts to maintain diplomatic composure. I appreciate the sentiment, but I should have some input regarding who I marry. We barely know each other. He was doing his job. You can't just decree marriages because someone did their job well. I can and I have. Queen Vaendra's tone suggested this conversation was over regardless of additional protests. You will have 60 days of courtship to become properly acquainted. You will attend social functions together, dine together, and demonstrate to this court that the arrangement is viable. After 60 days, the marriage will proceed according to traditional ceremony. This is law. This is honor. This is decided. Rowan tried again. Your Majesty, with respect, this seems like an extreme response to a security incident. Perhaps a commendation or, do you find my daughter unsuitable? What? No, that's not. Rowan felt his carefully constructed diplomatic language skills collapse entirely. I'm a security officer. I have no title, no political value, no assets beyond standard military pension contributions. This makes no practical sense from any strategic perspective. You believe marriage should be strategic. I believe arranged marriages between royalty and completely inappropriate commoners should at least have a strategic justification, yes. Several nobles made sounds that might have been scandalized gasps or appreciative laughter. Queen Vaendra's expression remained absolutely neutral in ways that made Rowan certain he just committed some kind of terrible protocol violation. You are correct that you have no title. That will be rectified through marriage. You are incorrect that you have no value. You demonstrated the highest value possible when you chose her life over yours. The marriage will proceed. I object, Princess Listen said clearly. Noted and overruled. You can't just overrule my objection to my own marriage. I can and I have. 60 days. Make them count. Queen Vaendra stood, which apparently signaled the end of the audience because every noble in the throne room executed synchronized formal bows that suggested extensive practice. Court dismissed. The nobles filed out with the efficient movement of people eager to gossip somewhere else. Rowan stood frozen on expensive carpet, his brain still attempting basic functions like processing reality. Princess Listen descended from the dais with the careful control of someone resisting the urge to run screaming, stopped directly in front of Rowan, and said very quietly, "This is insane. Yes, we should probably talk somewhere private." Yes. They walked in silence through corridors designed for aesthetic contemplation, past carved stone and nobles who stared with obvious interest, until reaching a garden pavilion that somehow existed inside a starship and demonstrated the kind of environmental engineering that made Rowan appreciate why this vessel was considered a historical artifact. Real plants grew in carefully maintained atmospheric conditions. Water flowed through channels that defied both gravity and common sense, and the privacy was absolute. Listen sat on a stone bench, put her head in her hands, and made a sound that was either laughter or despair. My mother is many things, but I've never known her to be completely irrational. This is completely irrational. Rowan remained standing because sitting seemed too casual for a conversation about forced marriage to royalty. There has to be a way to contest this. Appeals processes, legal challenges, diplomatic interventions. You heard her cite law and tradition. In Veltharan legal structure, those override everything except direct threats to planetary security. Listen looked up, her expression exhausted. She's been planning this. All those visits during your recovery, asking about your family and your future. She was determining if you were viable for this insane arrangement. I'm not viable for this insane arrangement. I'm a security officer who almost died because of inadequate threat assessment. You almost died protecting me. Apparently that's more important than adequacy. Listen stood, paced 3 steps, turned back. We barely know each other. You've seen me at diplomatic functions and medical recovery visits. I've seen you being professional and nearly dead. This isn't a foundation for marriage. Rowan wanted to argue, discovered he couldn't, because she was absolutely correct except for one detail he wasn't ready to admit. So what do we do? Apparently we have 60 days of mandatory courtship. Listen's laugh was bitter. We attend social functions, eat dinners, demonstrate viability to people who have already decided our marriage is either fascinating or horrifying, depending on their political positions. Then we get married regardless of how we feel about it. They stood in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of water defying physics. Rowan's ribs ached. His synthetic lung membranes reminded him that breathing was complicated. The formal uniform felt wrong in approximately 7 different ways. For what it's worth, Rowan said carefully, during your visits I started looking forward to them, more than the pain medication, more than medical clearance. You made recovery less terrible, which I appreciate even if the current situation is catastrophically uncomfortable. Listen met his eyes. Her expression shifted to something softer. I haven't slept properly since the attack. I keep seeing you breaking against bulkheads while protecting me. Gratitude and guilt and something else I can't identify, all mixed together into feelings I don't have words for. So we attempt the courtship genuinely. We attempt the courtship genuinely, not to satisfy my mother, but to determine if this impossible decree might become something we'd choose. Listen smiled slightly. Though I should warn you that choosing to marry me means extensive formal ceremonies, political complications, and probably disappointing my mother's expectations just for entertainment value. Sounds terrible. It really does. When do we start? Dinner, tonight. The formal dining hall, 7th hour, where approximately 40 nobles will watch us eat and judge everything. Listen extended her hand. Try not to use the wrong utensils. It gives them something to gossip about for weeks. Rowan took her hand, felt warmth that had nothing to do with formal agreements. No promises. The first formal dinner was a disaster. Rowan used the wrong utensil for the 3rd course, which turned out to be a serious breach of etiquette that had 3 nobles whispering furiously, and 1 Carthian delegate making notes with what appeared to be disapproving enthusiasm. Princess Listen tried not to laugh, failed, covered it with a cough that fooled absolutely no one, and afterward told him that watching nobles get offended by silverware choices was the most entertainment she'd had in months. The second dinner went better, mostly because Rowan stopped caring about utensils and focused on the conversation. They argued about whether quantum entanglement could theoretically enable faster-than-light communication, disagreed about the ethical implications of artificial consciousness, and discovered that Listen had a weakness for terrible puns that made the Zenthari ambassador actually get up and leave in what might have been offense or appreciation, depending on how translation matrices handled wordplay. I can't believe you just said, I'm reading a book about anti-gravity. It's impossible to put down at a formal diplomatic dinner, Listen said later, walking through the botanical gardens that somehow existed inside a 400-year-old starship. You laughed. I'm embarrassed that I laughed. You're embarrassed that you have good taste in humor. There's nothing good about that pun. It's objectively terrible. But she was smiling, and her hand found his as they walked, and Rowan realized that the courtship had stopped feeling like obligation somewhere between the second dinner and this moment. Days accumulated into patterns. Morning walks through gardens where they discussed everything from childhood memories to the philosophical implications of discovering life existed on 17 different worlds. Afternoon sessions where Listen taught him basic Veltherin, while Rowan explained Earth military slang that made her question humanity's decision-making processes. Evening functions where the court watched them with expressions ranging from approval to barely concealed disapproval. And Rowan learned that some nobles considered human contamination of the royal bloodline either fascinating or horrifying, depending on political affiliations. He didn't fully understand. 40 days in, Rowan realized he'd fallen completely. Not because of the decree, not from gratitude, but from accumulated moments of genuine connection. The way Listen argued about linguistics with passionate intensity, her laugh that came easily now, how she'd admitted her brother died in the same colonial conflict where Rowan lost his squad, and they'd sat in shared grief for an hour without needing words. He didn't tell her because the courtship was already coerced, and declarations of love felt like additional pressure she didn't need. 50 days in, Listen appeared at his quarters late at night, still wearing formal attire from a state dinner, her expression vulnerable in ways he'd never seen. I need to say something before the marriage happens, and I lose the courage. Rowan waited, his heart doing complicated things that the medical monitors would probably find concerning. Watching you nearly die protecting me was the worst moment of my life. Not because of the attack, not because of political implications, but because losing you felt unacceptable in ways I couldn't explain. She stepped closer. Somewhere between explosions and garden walks and terrible puns at diplomatic dinners, I fell for you. This human who argues about Hemingway and makes me laugh and looks at me like I'm just Listen, not a princess. The decree stopped mattering because I'd choose this anyway. Rowan kissed her, which was probably another protocol violation, but seemed significantly more important than proper etiquette. I was trying not to tell you the same thing because I didn't want to add pressure. Idiot. Agreed. They had 10 days left when intelligence reports reached the flagship. The terrorist faction had regrouped. Their target remained Princess Listen, and they'd identified her location through sources that suggested inside assistance. Security increased immediately, but Rowan's instincts screamed insufficient. These were people who'd bombed a diplomatic station and accepted suicide missions. Guards and protocols wouldn't stop them. He requested assignment to personal protection detail again. The security chief approved with the kind of expression that suggested either respect or concern about Rowan's self-preservation instincts. The attack came during the pre-wedding celebration, which in retrospect was obvious timing that security should have anticipated better. Armed infiltrators, inside assistance from a corrupted crew member who'd been feeding location data for weeks, explosives placed throughout the grand hall where nobility gathered in ceremonial attire. Rowan spotted the threat 3 seconds before detonation. Not through equipment, not through training, but through the same impossible instinct that had moved his body in front of Listen the first time. Muscle memory and terror, an absolute refusal to lose her combined into action without thought. He tackled Listen to the marble floor as the grand hall erupted in fire and chaos, his body shielding hers again, and for one terrible moment it was the same nightmare repeated. Except this time Listen didn't stay passive beneath his protection. She rolled, pulled the ceremonial blade from Rowan's formal uniform with efficient movement, and used it to defend them both when an attacker breached their position. Her xenolinguistics training became suddenly relevant as she shouted commands in the terrorist's native language, confusing him long enough for additional security to arrive and neutralize the threat with extreme prejudice. The aftermath was smoke, and ringing ears and Rowan's ribs reminding him that they'd been recently reconstructed and didn't appreciate being used as human shields twice in 3 months. Listen helped him stand, both of them covered in debris and minor injuries, her formal robes torn and his uniform ruined beyond repair. "You did it again," she said, her voice shaking with adrenaline or anger or both. "Yes. But you're an idiot. We've established this. I love you anyway." "Good, because the wedding is in 8 days and canceling would be diplomatically complicated." Listen laughed, actually laughed, standing in the wreckage of an assassination attempt. "My mother is going to be insufferable about being right." Queen Vaendra appeared through the smoke with royal guards, surveyed the destruction, looked at Rowan and listened standing together covered in evidence of violence survived, and smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose plans had worked exactly as intended. "I trust there will be no further objections to this marriage." "None," Listen said firmly, "though I'm marrying him because I choose to, not because you decreed it." "Of course." The Queen's expression suggested she'd known this outcome from the beginning. "I'm sure that distinction is very important to you both." 8 days later, Rowan stood in ceremonial attire that fit better than the previous formal uniform, watching Princess Listen walk toward him in traditional marriage robes of silver and blue that made her look like starlight given form. Representatives from 17 worlds filled the throne room, the same space where Queen Vaendra had decreed this impossible arrangement, and everything had changed since that day. The officiant spoke in Veltharan, then Terran Standard, asking questions that mattered. "Do you enter this union willingly?" "Yes," Listen said without hesitation. "Yes," Rowan echoed, meaning it completely. They exchanged vows in both languages, promises about partnership and protection, and choosing each other daily regardless of decrees or traditions or royal expectations. Rowan slipped a ring onto Listen's finger. She placed one on his, and the assembled court erupted in approval that sounded genuine despite political complications that would probably last years. Afterward, during the reception where nobles congratulated them with varying degrees of sincerity, Listen leaned close and whispered, "I should warn you that being married to me means extensive formal ceremonies, political complications, and my mother constantly acting superior about her matchmaking skills." "That sounds terrible." "It really does. Worth it anyway." "Yes." She kissed him in front of assembled nobility, which was probably another protocol violation, but nobody seemed to object. "Though you're forbidden from taking any more explosions for me. I've already nearly lost you twice, and my heart can't handle a third time." "No promises." "Rowan." "Fine, I'll try to avoid explosions. No guarantees about other threats." "But you're impossible. You married me anyway." Queen Vaendra approached with the expression of someone who'd orchestrated events precisely to her satisfaction. "I trust you're both happy with this arrangement." "But we'd be happier if you admitted you planned this from the beginning," Listen said. "I'm sure I have no idea what you mean. I simply followed traditional law regarding life debts and royal marriages." The Queen's smile was absolutely shameless. That the arrangement resulted in genuine affection is merely fortunate coincidence. Rowan looked at Listen, her hand in his, her smile real, and realized that sometimes the most binding choices were those that began with no choice at all, and ended with the certainty that no other choice would ever suffice. He'd come to Nexus Prime seeking distance from loss, found purpose in protection, and discovered that nearly dying for someone could transform obligation into something resembling destiny if both people were willing to meet decree halfway with honest feeling. "Thank you," he told Queen Vaendra, surprising himself with sincerity. "You're welcome. Try not to get blown up again. The medical expenses are considerable." She walked away, leaving them to navigate marriage and politics and whatever came next. Listen squeezed his hand, ready for the rest of this impossible arrangement. "Absolutely not." "Good, me neither. We'll figure it out together." They walked into their future, hand in hand, ready for whatever complications came next.